Good afternoon, everyone. We see people coming into the waiting room. We'll just give it 1 more minute and then we'll get started with the program. So sit tight, also get used to the chat function as well, say hi, and then we'll pick up the program in just 1 minute while we give people that are running late a bit of time to join us. All right, I think let's get started. So good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. And welcome to this interactive webinar series on biodiversity information from data to decisions. So we'll have a first session today, and this is really part of a series on biodiversity mainstreaming organized by the Connect project. So my name is Stefan. I work at Prospects, and we're one of the partners in the Connect project. You'll also see our lovely speakers and our lovely panelists that we have for you today, and I'll introduce them shortly as well. Just a quick note on the Connect project. So Connect is a project funded by the Global Environment Facility, or Gbif, so implemented by UNEP and executed by UNEP-WCMC, so the World Conservation Monitoring Center. And what Connect really aims to do is to mainstream biodiversity into government decision-making in 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, so Ghana, Mozambique, and Uganda. So we also have 3 key partners there in those respective countries. So it's Ghana's National Biosafety Authority, it's the government of Mozambique, and Uganda's National Environment Management Authority. Also, to touch on this concept of biodiversity mainstreaming, just to get everyone up to speed, it really is about integrating actions, perspectives, and thinking related to conservation and biodiversity at every stage of a policy, plan, program, and project. So how do we really popularize or stimulate that sense of stewardship, to put it differently? Now, again, this will be a series of sessions, and we have 2 additional sessions lined up next week. So the first one on Monday, 12th of July at 1 p.m. British Summer Time, so the same time as today. And what we'll be doing in this Monday session, we'll be looking at tools for better cross-governmental decision-making. What are the challenges and benefits of biodiversity mainstreaming? And then we'll have a 3rd and final session on Tuesday, 13th of July, same time, so 1 p.m. British Summer Time. And we'll look at improving the value chain of biodiversity data. So what are the obstacles, the gaps, and the opportunities? So if you haven't registered for those sessions yet, please do so. And we really hope to see you next week for those sessions. And if I could ask Laura or Kira to put in perhaps the registration links in the chat, that would be excellent. And thanks, Laura, to change the slide. So for this session today, what we're looking at is mainstreaming. We're looking at a mainstreaming biodiversity roundtable to focus on a project best practices exchange. So what we really want to do with the session today is to discuss and distill those key ingredients for biodiversity mainstreaming projects. What are some of the success ingredients for projects and programs more generally? So in terms of the agenda, we're just going through the welcome and introduction. That is an interactive session, so we really do want to hear from you very, very often, as much as possible. So we've built in quite a few interactive elements here. So first off, we'll start with a poll on best practice ingredients, so already start thinking there. But then further for the agenda, we'll hear from our 4 panelists, of course. So we'll have Andrew Rodriguez from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Then we'll have Dilys Rowe from the International Institute for Environment and Development. Thirdly, we'll have Stanley Density from the Network for Environment and Sustainable Development in Central Africa. And last but not least, we'll have Alex Marsh from the South African National Biodiversity Institute, or SAMBI. Then to continue with the interactive elements, we'll have an interactive panel discussions, best practices, tools, tips, and tricks. You'll have the option there to ask your questions, to take the floor as well. And then we'll actually look a bit ahead in a plenary discussion, including with yourself. What are those ideas for future projects? What are promising topics that we want to take on in the future? Then we'll go into conclusions and final remarks, and that should be during about 2 hours for our session, and we'll close it today. In terms of the ground rules for the session, for the housekeeping, just a quick overview. So the session today will be recorded, so please do let us know if that's an issue. For your microphone and camera, please, we do recommend you turning on your camera so we can put names to faces as well. But please do mute yourself unless you're taking the floor, obviously. In terms of questions, if you want to ask a question, please do so in the chat function. We'll take those questions on or comments on as we go along. But you can also propose to take the floor by raising your hand, and then we'll bring you in at the right time. Just for the ease of viewing, we would really recommend this side-by-side mode. Side-by-side mode, we will be presenting some slides and showing some slides throughout this session. If you have any technical issues, please do send a direct message to Laura via the chat, and then we can help you out and sort you out. Quick note for today also on the interpretation. So we have Mayra, Alejo, and Barbara helping us out with the simultaneous interpretation today into Portuguese. So for those who would like, they can click on the globe logo with the subtext interpretation below. So para quem quiser seguir em português, pode clicar no botão interpretação abaixo. I hope I didn't butcher that, but also, again, if you want to raise your point or question in Portuguese, you can also do so via the chat function, and we'll sort that out. So just a final point here is to introduce my colleagues Kira as well, who will be co-facilitating alongside me, and of course also Laura, who will be the technical support for this session. By way of introduction, just to get things started, please if you could introduce yourself via the chat function. Just give us your name, your organization, where you're from also, because when we saw the registrants coming in, we saw people from all over the world. So please do use the chat function and just introduce yourself and use your social media accounts. It helps with the networking. So that being said, I think we're done with the welcome and the official introductions. I want to go to the first exercise to do with all of you, and we'd like to launch this poll with you. So Kira, if you could launch and share your, sorry, Laura, if you could share your screen. So think about this question. So today we are talking about these best practices for biodiversity mainstreaming projects. So what do you think are the key best practice ingredients for a successful biodiversity mainstreaming project? Now, please, when you're submitting your answer via the poll, please do keep it short, maximum 2 to 3 words, I would say. And it doesn't have to be necessarily only about biodiversity mainstreaming. It can, of course, be a project around sustainability or environment as well. So if you could go to menti.com and use the codes that you see there, and then and it's also been posted in the chat. Thanks, Laura. If you can go there and have a think and submit your answers, and I think we should be seeing some comments and inputs coming up relatively soon. So let me just give you a few minutes. Perfect. See the first points coming in: processes, tools, products, and people. And hi, Edward from Ministry of Food and Agriculture, Ghana. Thanks. Some additional points coming in: traditional knowledge, inclusive practices. We'll definitely touch on that during the panel discussion about inclusivity. So how do we make sure that we have some representativeness in this stakeholder community for each project? So a really good point there. Communication as well. So how do you communicate and engage with different stakeholders? Would also bring that in. Good data. I think that will be a point for Andrew in particular later on. How do you define good data? So let's put a pin on this. How do we include traditional knowledge? I think is also an important one. I think we'll be using, in any case, this backdrop as a reference framework for the rest of the session, so we can pick up those points as we go through the session. But I'm seeing some really poignant and relevant points to take on during our session. Excellent. Collaborative partnerships. So how do you collaborate across sectors between different organizations? What are some of the tensions that could arise, and how do you solve those? That's something that we will touch on as well during our session. And hi, Cecilia from Mexico, but you're based in Paris, so it's a little less early for you. Perfect. Great. So please do, if you have other best practices that you want to input during this particular session, please put them into our poll, and then we can pick up some points also with our panelists as we go through the session. But this was really useful. Already gives us a good reference framework to work through during this session. Perfect. So without further ado, I'd actually like to give the floor to Andrew Rodriguez, our first speaker and panelist for today. So Andrew is a program officer for participation and engagement at the Global Biodiversity Information Facility Secretariat. So Andrew, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Stefan. I'm just going to share my screen now. So hopefully you should all see my screen in presentation mode. So can you see that, Stefan? Is that?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, brilliant. So, yes, as Stefan said, I'm a program officer here at the Secretariat of Gbif, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility in Copenhagen. And I just want to give you an overview of work that we've been doing through our Biodiversity Information for Development, or BID program, over the last 6 years now almost. And yeah, to mobilize data, and I've taken a specific focus on our Africa work in here, but mobilizing data for decision making. So first of all, who are we? What is Gbif? So Gbif is an intergovernmental network and research infrastructure. So we currently comprise of 61 countries around the world, and an additional 40 international organizations. And these countries and organizations commit to providing anyone, anywhere, open access to data about all types of life on Earth. And I'll go into the details of what that data is in a second. But these countries and organizations collaborate through a voluntary memorandum of understanding, of which they all sign. And part of that memorandum of understanding is the creation of a node structure. And this node coordinates data publishing activities at a national or an organizational level to make the data within those countries or in those organizations freely available through our platform. And I have a picture of our platform here, www.gbif.org. And it's through this platform that you can search all the data that we make available. And we currently have nearly 1.8 billion records, and I'll go into what that means in a second, that users can go in, search all around the world, download that data and use for their own purposes. So I talked about the data, and I noticed that some of you started talking about the importance of data. So what kind of data that we have? Well, we have data on where species have lived and when. So typically the data has a scientific name for a species. It will have some locality information for that species. It will also have when that collection or observation of the species was made. And sometimes we'll also have additional information on how that data was collected. And we bring in data from a wide range of institutions around the globe that have this kind of data. So this data can be in digitized specimens. So this could be in, for instance, museum collections or herbaria. But we also bring in data from observations through citizen science networks and programs. And this is currently the largest amount of data that we have comes through these networks. But we also can bring in data through literature when there are new species records in the literature, through remote sensing as well. And we've just recently, last year, started to integrate environmental DNA data from metagenomics. Key to bringing in all this data from all these different institutions is the standardization of this data. So we bring it all into a common standard that we call, that's called the Darwin Core. And so publishers or institutions holding this data, they will standardize their data into the Darwin Core, and then they will attribute a Creative Commons license to their data, which essentially gives us the permission to share their data with the rest of the world. So we'll then index that data and we'll make it available through www.gbif.org for reuse. And so that's the data that we as an organization deal with. So just to give you an overview, in Africa, where we've been working a lot on this program. So the map on the left is our current distribution of data across the continent of Africa. So where you have the darker orange and red is where we have the most data on the continent. Green are the areas where we have the least amount of data across the continent. We currently have 10 voting participants. So these are countries in Africa that pay into Gbif and are part of our governing board. We have 11 associate country participants. So these don't have voting rights, but they still sign up to the voluntary memorandum of understanding. And we also have 4 other associate participants or international organizations on the continent that are part of our network. We have 144 publishing institutions on the continent. We currently have nearly 38 million occurrence records coming in for Africa. We also have a literature tracking system. So this is, so when users come into Gbif and download data, we attribute a digital object identifier or DOI to their downloads. We ask of our users to cite that DOI in the use of that data. And when they correctly cite the use of that data, we can track that. So here's just some examples of how the data is being used in Africa. And we can see that when we categorize that data, it crosses many streams across sustainable development. So there's a large amount of the uses in conservation, but we've also found uses in food security, climate change, and human health. So we're really seeing the data being used in a range of areas. One of the things, so I showed you the map of Africa a few slides before, and one of the key concerns for us as an organization are data gaps. So we have high data density in what we would call the global north, so North America, Europe, Australia. Where we have far fewer data is in the global South, Asia, Africa, South America. And part of the BID program, the Biodiversity Information Development Program, was to fill in some of those gaps. So the overall objective of the program was for the improved management of natural capital for human well-being through increased application of biodiversity information as evidence for decision making. So not only did we want to fill in this gap, so bring in more data for these areas, but we also wanted to make sure that data was feeding into some sort of decision-making process. I should say that this program is focused purely on sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. So that was the scope of the funding that we received through the EU. And we have had an extension of that funding through to 2023 for a second phase with a budget top-up from the EU. Part of this program was a capacity enhancement aspect. So we funded 63 projects across Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, and we organized workshops throughout the projects in both data mobilization, so how to standardize data and how to publish through Gbif, and the use of that data, so how to use that data to create information products that could be used in decision making. To build capacity up in these regions for those different activities. So you can see just a quick overview in the first phase, which started in 2015 of all, we had over 500 concept notes, we took that down to 63 funded projects. And just to give you some of the outcomes from that first phase, so in Africa, we funded 50 projects that covered 27 African countries. We had 354 data sets that were published in Gbif from 67 new data publishers. So I showed you that we had 144 publishers in Africa now. 67 of those came in through this program, which started in 2015. So we've really increased the numbers of publishers in Africa through the program. We have 10 new Gbif participant countries in Africa that, as a result of this program. And we have a growing community of practice in biodiversity informatics. So I talked about the workshops that we ran for building capacity in these regions. We provide certification of skills following the training, and what we now have a good community of practice in those regions in biodiversity informatics. So you can see the map as well shows you the distribution of data that we've had coming in through this project. We've also brought in mentors and training from across our community around the world. So they've been helping institutions and projects across Africa to mobilize and use the data. And just in terms of numbers, so we've seen a 321% increase in species occurrence records from target countries. So this is data with coordinates and a time of collections. We've had a huge amount of increase in the amount of data coming out from Africa over the last 5 years. For more than 80,000 different species, 27% of these were first records for Gbif in the country. So it was the first time that species has been recorded, or at least made accessible, that data for the first time in that country. We've had over 2,000 distinct scientific names reported for the first time in Gbif. So species that we had no data for before, we now have 2,000 new data points for those species coming into the program. And we have data on 1,100 threatened species, of which 22 were for the first time in Gbif. So this program has really had quite a large impact in the region in terms of data coming through. As part of that, we also, so this is the first time we've ran specifically the decision-making part of these mobilization activities. So we asked projects to identify how this data would be feeding into decision-making processes. And we put together a best practices document where we took out some of the key principles from some of the more successful projects in BID in terms of how to best engage with decision makers, for instance, into identifying identifying user needs, engaging your data holders, how do you bring in people with the data you need for your project? How can you strengthen collaboration? Are there collaborations at a national and international level that can help support the activities you want to do? Capacity building, how do you build up the technical expertise to be able to do some of these things? Communication, how do you provide the data in the right formats for the users? And then how do you ensure the sustainability of these processes? So we've put together this document to help future projects in terms of how they might, thinking how they can mobilize data for decision making. And we've just started our second phase. So we had a call for proposals launched on the 10th of June 2020. This is eligible for all sub-Saharan Africa, apart from South Africa, and also again for the Caribbean region and the Pacific. For Africa, we had 600,000 euros available for grants. And we had 4 different types of grants. We had regional data mobilization grants. This is mobilization of data from across several countries in the region. We had national data mobilization grants, which is where we brought in several institutions at the national level to mobilize data. We have institution level data mobilization grants. And it's different this time around, as we have a specific data use grant where we expect the projects to have taken some of the key principles from the previous phase and to really feed that data into decision-making processes. So this is where they've identified a specific policy that they want to feed the data into. They've established the communication with their decision makers. It's much more focused around the data use side. So we started implementation with that. The Africa project started 2 months ago, and we'll have the Caribbean and the Pacific project starting in August of this year. And yes, so that was just a brief overview. I'm sure there'll be some questions from participants.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Andrew. I mean, a lot to touch on there, and we'll leave some, of course, for the panel discussion later on. Love to hear also how this those future projects about environmental DNA would work and get some of the insights there. Just when you showed the map with all those red dots and the data data intensity was, what do you think is the sort of the biggest challenge when it comes to collecting that data and improving that data density across the African continent? Some thoughts from you there. You're still on mute, Andrew.
So this is in terms of how do we fill the gaps in. So yeah, so I mean, as you saw on the continent, there are some areas where we're working very well. We have some very our nodes are doing exceptionally good work, and the institutions and the projects that we have to identify data. But there are still going to be areas where we will have difficulties in getting some of that data. And some of this data is held in what we might consider non-traditional sources of data. So this could be, for instance, in the private sector. This could be, so I know from previous experience working with the forestry sector that they have a lot of data in the forestry sector, and these aren't people that we would traditionally engage with, but we are now starting to work with the private sector to bring in some of this data that's being collected in through their impact assessment processes. And then we also have new ways to we're integrating new data sources. So you mentioned environmental DNA, for instance. So that is definitely something that is key for things like freshwater biodiversity, for instance. And that is something that we're looking to integrate these new data sources. Remote sensing is another one where we need to do additional work to bring in to try and cover some of those gaps, because I mean, when you look at the map of Africa, for instance, it's quite obvious that the Congo is a big area where it's difficult for us to get data just because there are problems of accessibility. So yeah, looking for other solutions in terms of integrating data sources, new data sources, but also engaging with new, what I would consider non-traditional data holding institutions.
Yeah, wondering that's sort of a difference in semantics. I remember from the Mentimeter exercise that we did, we also saw that point about how do you integrate traditional knowledge as well. Maybe get your thoughts on this later on. But to raise that point also from the poll that we did, how would you define good data? Is all data equal? Just to touch on that.
It really depends on what you're using the data for. So, and I think one of the key things when looking at data is understanding what you want to do with the data. I mean, it really depends. I mean, we have some, so from our side, in terms of an organization, we have some routines that we can flag quality control. So there'll be some issues which just through our data processing workflows will occur. So we integrate data from a huge number of institutions. Each of these institutions will have their own way of processing data with their own knowledge of how to manage that data. So we can come up with some workflows based on standards, controlled vocabularies, those sorts of things, where we can flag some of these data quality issues. And that can be a first step for getting rid of some of what might be low quality data. But then defining high quality data really depends on the use that you want to do. So if you want to do, for instance, niche modeling, then you'll probably want something with a very high resolution. So something where you can go to a really precise point on the globe, and you can connect that with environmental variables that you can then put into models. But if you're just looking for a list of species found in a protected area, for instance, that would not necessarily require such a high level of resolution. So yes, the quality issue, it really depends on the use of how you intend to use that data.
Yeah. So in that data collection process, but also in the assessment of the quality, it's really to think about as a first step, what are we going to use this data for?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So question from Martin Watson. Hi, Martin. And please, for other participants, please do put in your question in the chat function. We can take those on. when we have the opportunity. So the question from Martin Andrew is, how is Gbif data being used and by whom?
So currently so it's used in a whole wide range. There are a whole wide range of uses for the data. So our current tracking system will detect if the data has been cited in a publication or in a report or anything that can be found through the internet. We can detect that DOI and we can track it too. So we'll categorize that in terms of reports, scientific publications. We can track its use in media. We can track we have lots of different categories for categorizing the use. And so that kind of touches on by whom. It's when we can track the use of it, as in with a correct citation, then we can see who's using it. It's being used predominantly by researchers right now, but we have noticed the use in media. We've used it in reports that are used in decision-making processes. And yeah, we're constantly looking at better ways to track the data and its use.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. A lot of food for thought already. A question that just came in from Hyacinth. Hi there. So Hyacinth's question, Andrew, and then we'll move on to Dilla, the second speaker. So Hyacinth just missed what was said regarding the BID project in the Caribbean. So how is the second phase going to be rolled out, through what projects and what countries? Andrew.
Yes, so we're just going through the process now of choosing our projects. I think we may have made the announcements yet of who the projects, but the second phase for the Caribbean was offered to, so originally the first phase was restricted only to the Caribbean islands, excluding territories. We extended that to countries with coastlines bordering the Caribbean. So that included some countries in Mesoamerica and South America. We're just going through the proposals now. And yes, I think the decisions they will have been made or they'll be made very soon. I don't want to say, but they will be made. The decision will be made very soon. So, and the implementation will start in August for those projects.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Perfect. I'd like to move on to our second speaker today. So it's Dilys Rowe of the International Institute for Environment and Development. And Dilys she leads the Institute's work on biodiversity and conservation. Dilys, please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to speak here. Yeah, great. I was just about to say I'm hoping that WCMC have got some of my slides to show. So I wanted to talk about political economy analysis as a tool for helping really insert biodiversity information into development decision-making. We've been a partner on the Connect project, and this was the area that we focused on, helping to support the country teams in undertaking political economy analysis prior to thinking about how they might target their biodiversity information. So if I could have the next slide, please. So what is political economy analysis? Essentially, it is just a tool for making politically informed interventions. So people like us, I suspect most of the people that are on this call are, people that are sort of working for nature, trying to build awareness of nature, make cases for the importance of biodiversity and the environment. But we quite often fail to understand the complexities of politics and power and how real-world decision-making actually happens. So we quite often tend to make a technical case for protecting nature or managing nature, but not necessarily being aware of some of the important interests of the people that actually make decisions about nature and the people that we need to influence. Or we're unaware of some of the unwritten rules about how decisions are made, how change happens, who holds power and influence and who doesn't. So when we look back at the history of environmental mainstreaming, we can see that the really successful approaches are those that have had a much clearer eye on issues of political economy, that those that sort of understand how change happens. So they seek to try and find and create political will to engage with the right decision-making processes that can support them, and to develop strategies that mobilize champions and bring blockers, people who are potentially against environment, on side. So biodiversity analysts are producing vast amount of information and data. And you just heard from Andrew, 1.8 billion records, I think you said, in Gbif alone. But a lot of this is just totally ignored by decision makers because either it's not produced at the right time or in the right format or addressing the right issues. And so even when biodiversity information and data is technically good, if it isn't presented in the right way at the right time, it will be overlooked. So I think this cartoon here illustrates this problem. In the first frame, you have somebody talking about climate change and how it's an existential threat. They're talking to some sort of black-suited decision makers who are clearly very uninterested, most of them yawning in their seats and just totally switching off. And I've been in so many meetings where people are yawning in their seats or even fast asleep while you're talking to them because they just don't see that what you're talking about is important. So the guy wipes out his message, changes it. Climate change threatens our economy. And all of a sudden, everybody's animated and they're concerned and shocked, and they've engaged with this because presumably these people are economists. And so this is now a problem for them and is attracting their attention. So this is what we need to be thinking about when we're trying to make the case for nature and for biodiversity. Political economy analysis can help us do that. Next slide, please. So there's lots of different definitions of what political economy analysis is. And it is actually a sort of an academic field as much as a practical one. And most commonly in academia, it's understood as a form of study, a form of multidisciplinary study, drawing on a whole range of sectors, economics, politics, history, law, and so on and so forth, in order to help understand and explain the role of political factors in influencing how decisions are made. It could also be called context analysis. So it really, just in simple terms, means understanding the context in which you're operating, being aware of the biases and the barriers of the audiences that you're targeting. And it's those biases and barriers which are part of the political economy in which decisions are made. So taking a political economy perspective really simply means recognizing that decisions are not made in a vacuum, and they're rarely made on the basis just of scientific evidence. Pretty much all decisions that are made as much for political reasons as they are for scientific or technical reasons. So it means understanding that context, that political context in which decisions are made. And by political context, I don't necessarily mean just thinking about politicians or political parties. Everyday politics is about who has power and who doesn't, who is able to influence who responds to what kinds of incentives and who doesn't. All of these things affect how information is used or ignored and how decisions are made. And that's really what we mean by political economy. It's politics with a small p, everyday politics, not party politics. So in the Connect project, we put a lot of emphasis on undertaking a political economy analysis in order to understand the demand for biodiversity information before setting out to create more biodiversity information or biodiversity information products. And as I say, we could have just as easily called it context analysis. And in fact, that's what we did end up calling it in the Connect project, because in a couple of countries where we were working, that the whole term political was a political issue in itself, and people were concerned that it might be negatively construed. So we sort of simplified it and talked about context analysis. And that's what we're trying to emphasize here. If we want to understand the demand for biodiversity information, we have to understand who's demanding it, who isn't, what influences that demand and why, how decisions based on that information are made, how they're blocked or influenced by others, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So perhaps in summary, to think about the purpose of PEA, it's really to find our way through a maze. So at the bottom corner here, we've got multiple different stakeholders with multiple different ideas, multiple different constituencies, their own agendas, all sorts of sort of competing powers and influences. And at the other end of the maze, we have a simple answer, a simple decision, a yes, a no, a maybe, but a straightforward decision. But getting from that complicated mix of stakeholders to that simple decision requires complicated route through a maze. And political economy analysis is intended to help us get through that maze. So it's intended to help build a systematic understanding of the political and governance context that influence the success of efforts to tackle a specific problem or specific issue. So in the case of the Connect project, the issue was the better use of biodiversity information in government development decision-making. So PEA helps understand political mandates and roles, opportunities, barriers and risks, and so on and so forth. So by understanding all these things, we can help identify the best way through that maze. We can help improve project strategies. We can recognize that often technically good projects are going to fail because of institutional, cultural, or power issues. So it can really add value to sort of project management and communication strategies by providing special insights into terms of engagement, incentives, coalitions, and communications. Next slide, please. So this is the publication that I don't think it's currently published, but is due to be published by the Connect project. And as I said, we worked with the country teams. We produced some draft guidance to help them undertake a political economy analysis or context analysis prior to thinking about their biodiversity information products. And then we used the experience of the countries in applying this approach to update and finalise our guidance. And I know the Connect countries are on the call, and so perhaps some of them might chip in when we have a discussion about how useful they found this process. But overall, we found that doing this political economy analysis helped countries identify the key sectors on which they could focus their biodiversity information products and the key decision-making processes and entry points. It is complex, though, and I'm sure that's one of the first things that the country teams might say. This was a complicated process. It took quite a long time to work through this whole process. And it's often carried out by specialised consultants or even teams of consultants. But everybody can actually go some way to making sure their interventions are more politically informed. So following the experience in Connect, many people asked for something much more simple, a very light touch guide to doing PEA that could be used in a number of different biodiversity mainstreaming situations. So this is what we're currently finalising as our last activity, from IIED's perspective, as our last activity within the Connect project. Next slide, please. So our simple guide to PEA, it provides a lot of background into the theory of it and PEA as an academic discipline, but it essentially sets out 4 key tasks that most people could conduct themselves, or they could identify where they need specialists to help them carry out these tasks. And the 4 tasks, they're not linear, they are interactive, and there's a lot of back and forth between the 4 of them. So we've sort of presented them in this form of a Venn diagram to show how they overlap and how you might be going backwards and forwards on a regular basis between them. But essentially, just a quick description of the tasks. The first one is to really scope out the purpose and the plan of the PEA and conduct a really short and high-level exercise to be really clear about why you are doing the analysis, who the users of the analysis are and the target audience, what the kinds of political issues might be that affect the potential for nature to be mainstreamed, and the kinds of outcomes that you're seeking by doing this analysis, and therefore the kinds of questions that you need to address. So the first task is really to kind of think through the overall analysis, think about the main activities that need to be done, who needs to do them, and then lay them out in a work plan. And then the first sort of major step, task 2, is really analysing stakeholders. So here we want to know who or what favours mainstreaming nature in development decision making and what disfavours it or seeks to undermine it. So it's too easy to just assume that certain stakeholders are for nature and certain stakeholders are against nature and just make a simple list of them. And those are the ones you need to target. But in practice, pretty much every stakeholder has multiple different interests. And so you need to understand not just their interests, but also their powers to act on their interests and to influence decision making. So it's not just about coming up with a long list of organizations and individuals that you need to target. It's about really understanding them and how they relate to each other and what their influence is. And there's loads of existing tools available for doing stakeholder mapping and power mapping. These are techniques used by many involved in participatory research and professional communications. And then once you know who your key stakeholders are, what they're interested in, what their powers and influences are, then the third task is to understand how change happens. So change is never simply a matter of different stakeholders being able to assert their power or influence. It's all about how their power relates to other people's powers, how narratives evolve, and also what are the processes for discussing, agreeing, and organising change. So it's a really important part in this task to find out what stakeholders think are the most effective processes. Is it coming up with new legislation and regulations? Is it convening meetings? Is it having a strike or going on a march and organising some kind of social upheaval? What is it that's brought about change in the past that's been successful, and what might we be able to tap into to bring about change in the future? So process might seem quite a dull matter, but it's certainly as important as content. And then the final task is to really sort of then develop a politically informed strategy for bringing about change. So this brings together the findings from the previous tasks in order to summarise the big issues that affect nature, both positively and negatively, and where decisions might need to be influenced, and then identifying which are the priority decision-making processes and the priority stakeholders to target in order to address these positive and negative issues. And what are the key entry points for gaining leverage? Is it going to a critical meeting, talking to a critical person, and so on and so forth? And then finally, this task is about actually using those findings to bring about change. So making sure you get them into meeting agendas, into briefing papers, into project documents, communication strategies, whatever is appropriate for the kind of change that you're seeking to influence. Next and final slide, please. So we're all anxious to avoid the clash between environment and development that this cartoon depicts. It would be really nice to think that all we had to do in order to avoid this clash was to provide high quality data and compelling evidence, and then people would sit up and take notice of us. But the reality is that the process of decision making and the hidden power and influence that affects decision making is just as critical as the information that we provide. So just as we're getting better at producing more quality and better information, so we need more routine use of PEA or PEA-like approaches in order to really help us better target that information so that it hits the right people in the right places at the right times. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Dilys. If I could ask Laura just to bring up the results, the initial results of our survey, because I think a lot of what you touched on, there were some points from that Mentimeter exercise that we did that you also touched on as well, Dilys. And I mean, you've used the term political economy, then you also used context analysis. I think it's what you did is also a form of systems thinking, precisely because you're trying to map that system and how people within that system interrelate to each other. So there were a few things here as well that I found quite striking. You have the policy links top right as well. There was a point here also about the systematic part of it as well. There was also a point that I can't find about interests and what do people want as well.
Yeah.
I think the question I wanted to ask you, and then please do, if there's any other questions, please use the chat. I was reminded of this very recent, of these recent newspaper articles about Greenpeace sort of doing an operation with this Exxon Mobil lobbyist who explains just the concept of captive politicians. So he explains, well, this person has re-election coming up in 2 years, so we actually know that he or she would be very, very, very receptive towards our arguments. So I'm wondering, you made a point about, we need to influence people at the right place at the right time. How did you do this? And then if a person is not sort of influenceable at first, how do you nudge them to still have to be more to take on your arguments more? How do you nudge people that way?
Yeah, so I think first of all, identifying who are the nudgeable people is really important, and that's a key element of the sort of the whole power mapping. So when you do that with your stakeholders, you then kind of look at, who do you need to influence and actually has power, who's interested and has power to bring about change, either positively or negatively, and they really are your target people to focus on, because they've both got the interest and the power. But then you also identify who has power but not necessarily the interest, and those are the people you can nudge with really good communication. So that's where you really need to sort of be making your case and nudging them to use their power to be supporting your case rather than being against it. So that sort of critical mapping of not just who's got interest, but who is able to wield power and influence in order to use that interest is really critical. And there's lots of people that have a high level of interest in biodiversity and environment, but actually no power to do anything about that. So while they are our allies and might help us build a strong communications case, it's really critical to know that, to understand how decisions are made, and therefore target the people that can actually make the decisions and bring about change. So that's why we were saying that it's a really key task, that kind of quite systematic analysis of key stakeholders, making sure that's as inclusive as possible. And that inclusivity was a sort of a key thing that also came up on the Mentimeter, but then not just coming up with a long list, really prioritizing your list by doing this kind of power and influence analysis.
Great, thanks, Dilys. There's a question coming in from Prince. So yes, Prince, this session is being recorded and it will be shared afterwards as well. So no fear of missing out whatsoever. Alex also made a point. So Alex will be one of the speakers today as well. Alex, I'm just wondering, could you just come in and just share your comments and by taking the floor?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I was just remarking that a lot of this approach synergizes a lot with what Sanbi has learned through kind of 20 years of Gbif project implementation, but it also for me really underscores the fact that mainstreaming takes time. It takes longer than expected every time a project is implemented, because the relationship building needed in order to create enough trust in systems is something that you can't really rush. And do you have any perspectives around how to build that into project design more effectively?
Great question.
Yeah, it is a really great question, and it really does take time. And I think it's something that we really, really underestimate. So I think building it into projects this is where I think doing more routine PEA more regularly, so that we're constantly sort of building relationships, understanding systems, and having that background knowledge and experience and connections, and not just having to start from scratch every time a new project comes along. So I think we would really argue to not just be seeing mainstream on a project by project basis or political economy analysis on a project by project basis, but by having these things as kind of underrunning currents through our portfolios of work, so that we've always got that knowledge, that connection to draw on. So as you say, a lot of mainstreaming, it takes time, because the time is spent in building relationships, understanding how the system works, knowing that critical meetings are coming up that perhaps there's not going to be any public invitation to them, but you need to be in the system to know that they're happening in order to be there, because that's where the decision is going to be made. And all of that is built on social capital that you can build up over time as a key sort of personal skill when you're trying to achieve mainstreaming. So I think you can build it into projects by kind of trying to systematize a lot of these approaches, stakeholder analysis and so on. But it is something that we just need to build into our skill set in a more routine way, rather than trying to always projectize it.
Yeah, so it's an aspect of skills, but then also a key challenge of how do you transcend sort of beyond project boundaries and keep that sort of social capital building going. Perfect. There's a question from Martin, and then we'll move to the next speaker. So Martin asks, the Connect project took place in 3 countries. Was the context very different in each country?
The political context was different, but the focus of the biodiversity information products was different in different countries, although 2 countries both decided to focus on the agriculture sector. But the political context was different in each country, but the process that we went through for the context analysis was the same in each country. So I think it's an approach that you can apply. You adapt it to suit the context, but you can apply it as a pretty much a standard in different political contexts.
Great, thanks, Dilys. Before I move to the next speaker, I think Kira, you wanted to come in and make a point, please.
Yeah, more of a reflection than a question, but I think it's just really interesting that, we use this term stakeholder all of the time, particularly in, biodiversity mainstreaming projects. And I think what the political economy analysis does really well is shows that stakeholder interests are incredibly diverse. And it's not just a case that you're either in the kind of pro-biodiversity camp or you're not. Interests are changing all the time, and stakeholders are not static, and neither are their interests. And I think, the political economy analysis shows that really well. Yeah.
And I think, as we've seen in the US, for example, one change, so the change in president in the US results in a huge change in the overall operating context for policy decisions and so on. So it's got to be agile as well, and not just seen as a sort of a static one-off exercise that you do. And then you're like, oh, okay, I now understand the political economy of the US or South Africa or Ghana or wherever. It's a constantly evolving situation. So you've got to be constantly on top of it, which I think sort of goes back to Alex's point about all of this stuff taking time and needing to be sort of constant and iterative.
Yeah. Perfect. Thanks so much, Dilys. I mean, I worked a lot in EU public affairs, representing different organizations. And one of the key challenges also was, how do we avoid putting our eggs in one particular political basket, precisely because you have elections and those new personalities come up and power dynamics shift. So I think it's an excellent point to finish off on. Perfect. I'd like to bring in the next speaker. So the next speaker is Stanley Density. He's Program Officer at the Network for Environment and Sustainable Development in Central Africa. And he's a National Ecosystem Assessment Coordinator in Cameroon. Stanley, please, the floor is yours. Stanley, can you unmute yourself, or can you hear us? I think there's some, Stanley, I think you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Can you unmute, mute and unmute yourself, or shift your microphone? But otherwise, I think I'll give you a few seconds, and otherwise we could move to Alex just to give you some time to fix things. Stanley, can you hear us? No problem. Stanley, we'll give you a bit of time to just adapt, and it will bring you in towards the end of the panel as a fourth speaker. So then I'd like to just bring in Alex So Alex Marsh, you just heard Alex intervene during Dillis's presentation. Alex Marsh, she's policy advisor for biodiversity finance and ecological infrastructure. She's also acting senior biodiversity policy advisor at SAMBI, so the South African National Biodiversity Institute. Alex, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, sorry. Just sorting out my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can, and we can hear you loud and clear. Go for it.
Great. Hi, everybody. Very nice to be with you today. And I'm going to be giving a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of South Africa's experience in mainstreaming over the past 15 or so years. And I'm going to start a little bit with our context and then our approach, look at a few examples of the kind of key mainstreaming wins that we've had and the lessons that have emerged from that, followed with some of the emerging work that we're doing.
Alex, could you just turn on your video camera if you want to, of course.
Let me try.
Yeah.
Okay, am I there?
Perfect. Yes, sorry to interject.
Right. All good. So South Africa is a country with the highest Gini coefficient in the world. So poverty and unemployment is a huge issue that is really the focus of our development agenda. We're also a mega diverse country. So that dynamic plays out very intensely, especially in rural areas. So that issue that we've already spoken about the perceived tension between biodiversity and development is something that we really focus on in our mainstreaming practice, trying to bring a message of the way that biodiversity underpins economic growth, as opposed to is conflicted with it. So in terms of our approach to mainstreaming, biodiversity and ecological infrastructure, and a few other things that we focus on, such as ecosystem-based adaptation, we frame it in a three-way action plan, looking at reducing loss, protection, and restoration. And those activities lie across different government sectors, across different tiers of government, and within a range of policies and strategies outside of the environmental sector. So like a deep polycentric governance approach is needed here. And likewise, with being able to monitor mainstreaming success, which I think is a very challenging thing to do, we try to look at both the means and the ends. So in terms of measurement, looking at the kind of knowledge products, the kind of capacity development, the kind of technology transfer that's being done, the changes in policies that lie in other sectors, and then more in a more challenging aspect of it is trying to monitor change in biodiversity over time as a result of these activities. And that's something that we're placing increasing focus on. Recent work that we're doing out of a project that I'll be mentioning later is around trying to better articulate what our practice is of mainstreaming. And within SANBI, we've been developing our mainstreaming practice across a series of Gbif-funded projects. And we've come to an understanding that, you know, SANBI is mandated to provide best available policy advice through strong science. And we do that through a mainstreaming approach. And part of that approach is around making the case, which is a piece of work that is underpinned by hope of gain as opposed to fear of loss. It's underpinned by bringing strong science, but also appealing to the legacy for future generations, and always including some kind of call to action with the messaging that we come to. And you'll see in this diagram that the informal networks of expertise and collaborative platforms are very strong here, just kind of underscoring the way that we work in kind of a deep social process in order to get the right people into the room to have the right kind of conversations. Looking at a few examples of key successes we've had over the years, mainstreaming is present in South Africa's NBSAP, quite strongly embedded in there. particularly using the terminology of ecological infrastructure, which has had a lot of traction in South Africa. We also have our critical biodiversity areas embedded within our national spatial development framework. So it's placed under eco-resource production regions, but it really has our key biodiversity areas embedded within the way that planning is approached in South Africa. And then under our spatial land use regulations, we've produced a guideline on how best to incorporate biodiversity into land use schemes. We also have guidelines for mining and biodiversity and a few other things, which we offer as policy advice to strengthen the implementation of policies. And then another piece of work that we are building on currently is making the case for the way that biodiversity provides jobs. And this piece of work kind of foregrounded the contribution that the biodiversity sector makes to economic development in South Africa, and came up with a comparison to the fact that the biodiversity economy creates around the same amount of jobs as the mining sector in South Africa, and can be regarded as a sunrise sector because of the untapped possibilities there. And we're currently building on that work through natural capital accounts for the biodiversity economy. Our natural capital accounting work is quite new and quite exciting. We're working very closely with our statistical division, and we have a guideline for natural capital accounts, and being able to look at environmental stocks and flows in parity with other accounting standards is being seen as quite a powerful vehicle for incorporating environmental issues in the country. And just to look at some key lessons we've learned out of all of these projects, some of these have been touched on already. We have found that working with spatial products through the development of maps through systematic biodiversity planning has been a key tool for effective mainstreaming in South Africa. And NCA is kind of following in that vein. Strengthening capacity for mainstreaming is also a big one. It needs to be systemic within the right institutions, and it can't be assumed that mainstreaming is going to happen alongside other functions, because it's quite a specific bundle of skills that you need to actively develop in order to make sure that mainstreaming is happening effectively. Some other lessons learned that we've also touched on, the need to develop a deep understanding of the system into which you're wanting to intervene before trying any kind of intervention, having the right framing of the message that you have, partnerships both at a national and at a catchment level have been really essential. And then there's also another aspect of paying attention, and there's a degree of agility that is quite important in engaging in effective mainstreaming. You have to know what's happening in the landscape and find the opportunities to respond quite quickly to emerging opportunities. And then lastly, a few emerging projects that we're working with. The Living Catchments Project, which is a partnership between the Water Research Commission and the Department of Science and Innovation and SANBI, has a focus on mainstreaming and policy advice. And we've just produced a mainstreaming assessment, and we're moving towards the development of a good practice guideline for mainstreaming in South Africa, which will be available at the end of next year. We also have an EI for water security project, that's a Gbif project, where the focus is on mainstreaming into the water sector and into finance sectors, where some really exciting work is being done with DBSA, the Development Bank of South Africa, and looking at other financial mechanisms. Work on strategic water source areas in South Africa is also very alive because it's included in our medium-term strategic framework. So strategic water source areas are 8% of the land cover that supplies 50% of the water. And in a desertified country, it's really crucial for us to find ways to secure that space. So the work that we've done to mainstreaming that concept has had a lot of traction across government, because the economic underpinning is so strong. And associated with that, we're developing a Green Climate Fund project around strategic water source areas. And then lastly, to say that we've been quite active in the Global Biodiversity Framework negotiations, supporting the African group of negotiators across the board, but also particularly in mainstreaming and looking at the long-term strategic approach for mainstreaming that's currently under discussion. And I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alex, and really impressive to see that sort of breadth of activities that you've been working on. Please do, if you have questions for Alex, please do flag them in the chat function. We'll bring those on. Just a question from my side, Alex. I think you've really worked very hard also on sort of building that evidence of the economic underpinnings of biodiversity. So I'm just wondering, and also it was really nice to see that graph showing the jobs related to the biodiversity sector. So I'm sure there's a lot of data underpinning this as well, showing that biodiversity, as you said, is a sunrise sector. I'm just wondering, with the advent of COVID, because oftentimes this sort of perceived trade-off between economic development and biodiversity is about short-term versus long-term things. I'm wondering, with the advent of COVID, do you think institutional stakeholders' mind shifts have shifted more towards the short-term thinking, i.e. more economic development? Did you experience anything there, any incident? And how do you also get people to think more long-term as well? Any thoughts on this?
One thing that happened during this COVID phase, which is often our job numbers are going down fast in South Africa, it's been a huge concern. And there was a presidential economic stimulus package that was released, and some of that came for kind of shovel-ready jobs. So, you know, in terms of being agile, SANBI put in a application to implement part of this project, and that provided quite a few hundred jobs on a short-term basis in response to COVID. And that went towards rehabilitation projects across the country. So in that way, we're quite focused on providing different case studies for the way that the biodiversity sector can really come to the party in creating jobs across South Africa. And that kind of has a legacy from the Working for Water project, which is still being implemented. So we have kind of the institutional infrastructure to a degree to be able to put people to work in landscapes. And I think that one of the other things that COVID has done, I mean, there's a lot of talk about a kind of green recovery and looking at how we can embed good practice into the way that we're trying to stimulate the economy post-COVID. And I think that it's also opened up a lot of discussions around resource mobilization and what that really means in South Africa, with the fiscus getting smaller. So no neat answers, but it's something that we're trying to be as responsive as possible to, because you know, we don't want that entrenched narrative around biodiversity in inhibiting people from accessing good quality jobs to exist.
Yeah, brilliant. You also made another point, is how do you get the right people in the room? Love to pick that up in our panel discussion as well. So thank you so much, Alex. I want to bring in our fourth and final speaker. So Stanley, have you reestablished connection? I think so. Can you give us a sign of life?
Thank you very much, Stefan, and sorry for the connection problem.
No problem. The floor is yours.
Because of the time when I was about to start.
No problem. Please, Stanley, go for it.
Thank you very much. I'm ready for the presentation. Can you project? Can you use your screen? Thank you very much. My name is Stanley Density. I am the project coordinator for the National Ecosystem Assessment for Cameroon. Thank you very much for this opportunity given to me to share Cameroon's experiences on stakeholder management in carrying out our national ecosystem assessment. Next slide. Yes. To begin, we have a short presentation here, 3 points to discuss. The first point will be on the importance of scientific information on biodiversity in supporting decision-making in Cameroon. Secondly, we will be looking at the importance of stakeholder engagement in Cameroon's national ecosystems assessment. And thirdly, we'll be looking at the approaches, we used in engaging stakeholders in the process. Well, the objective of this presentation is to, to share, showcase and share our experiences in engaging stakeholders in our national ecosystems assessment. Next slide. Yes, to begin with, we want to talk about the link that exists between information about diversity and decision making. And to get into that, I just want to give you some global knowledge, global understanding of the situation of biodiversity in Cameroon. And here I'm talking about the biodiversity potentials of Cameroon. And we're trying to say here that Cameroon has a rich biodiversity potential spread out in the country's 5 ecological zones and 6 ecosystems. What I want to say here is that the country has it's been split up, divided into ecological zones, and we also have 6 ecosystems that have been identified in Cameroon. For the agroecological zones, we have the Sudano-Saharan, the Guinea savanna, the highlands, the coastal and forest zones, agroecological zones. For the ecosystems, as I said, there are 6. We have the semi-arid, tropical wood savanna, montane, dense and humid tropical forest, marine and coastal and freshwater ecosystems. So Cameroon's rich potential, Cameroon's potential in biodiversity is scattered around, is distributed around these different areas, these zones and ecosystems in the country. But why information on biodiversity, that is information on biodiversity, why do we need this? It is very important, specifically, most important for the country or for policymakers, government stakeholders to understand the potential of biodiversity in a country. And in order to, carry out or develop policies, it is important to know. So there is one of the most important things to, one of the most important uses of this information on biodiversity is to inform policy. So the policymakers need to have an understanding, a global understanding of what obtains or what is present in the country, what the country has as potentials in biodiversity, be it flora or fauna. So this information helps them, to inform, or the information on biodiversity helps to inform policy or policymakers. And once these policymakers have an idea of the situation in the country, it helps them, to contribute in decision making. They can now carve out or design policies, based on the information that exists. So they can now decide. The knowledge on biodiversity helps them to develop or to bring out policies in relation to what obtains or what is present in the country. And this information it actually bridges the gap between science and policy, because policymakers cannot act properly, or they cannot take decisions, proper or good decisions, if they don't know exactly what obtains. Scientists have been carrying out research, and those the research material, the findings have been kept in boxes. But if those, the information that researchers and scientists get, if they don't bring that or get the information to policymakers through what we have developed in Cameroon, or through the project we have, the national platform for science and policy, which brings together policymakers and scientists and researchers to share ideas and to sit and to get to a common understanding of how to move on. So the research is now informing policy, and good and better policy and decisions are taken around the management and conservation of biodiversity in Cameroon. Next slide. Yeah, the importance of stakeholder engagement and approaches. We started our national ecosystem assessment in 2017, and we have been, engaging a number of stakeholders. We've been able to engage a number of stakeholders in the process. It's a process that cannot be handled by one or two, but it's supposed to be. It is important. It is going to be very successful if all stakeholders that are involved in the process are involved in the national assessment for Cameroon. All stakeholders involved in biodiversity in Cameroon. We struggle to bring them together to see how each stakeholder can contribute, each stakeholder can make their own contribution to ensure that we have the assessment is properly carried out. And to the left of the screen, we have importance of engaging stakeholders in the national ecosystem assessment. Well, I'm saying here that engaging stakeholders in the national assessment is of, it has a lot of opportunities. It comes with a number of opportunities. And the first opportunity is building capacities for carrying out national ecosystem assessment at national level. There are different stakeholders that were involved in the process. And each stakeholder had, an activity, had something to do, had a contribution, had a role to play. And for capacity building, the national ecosystem assessment was an opportunity to build national capacities to carry out assessment on the national ecosystem assessment. We had not done this before, per se, in an organized manner as we have it now. And so the stakeholders we had, especially, for example, here we had UNEP-WCMC, and they had a big role to play, in terms of developing capacities through trilogues, webinars, and at the level of Cameroon, we also had national workshops during which authors and researchers and other stakeholders had to learn and build their capacities on issues they had not known or on issues related to national ecosystems assessments. Building capacity in administrative and financial management. Yes, it's a project, and the national ecosystem assessment, I think it has its own specific approach. It is new. Cameroon happens to be one of those pilot countries who were engaged in the process, and all along the project and the process of the assessment, there are lots and lots of administrative and financial management issues that needed to that capacities needed to be built in order to ensure that the project went on smoothly. So we had global workshops. Well, due to COVID, at some point we had virtual workshops and webinars to share ideas and to learn on managing and managerial issues as far as the national ecosystem assessment is concerned. It was also an opportunity to valorize traditional knowledge. Valorizing traditional knowledge, especially bringing in our indigenous populations and local communities to be part of the process at each stage. We had indigenous people and local communities brought in to ensure that they had their own touch and they had to make their own contribution as far as the national assessment is concerned. So these are they formed one of those very important stakeholders which we brought them in, and we had to bring them in at the various stages. Even you know, they actually contributed in writing, and you know, even if not physically, but you know, some of the ideas were being transcribed, and a good number of them had to do some sections of the work. So and they had to make their own contributions by themselves. So this was very important for us, because we realized and we were actually ensured that traditional knowledge was valorized. Translating scientific knowledge. Well, again, it is very important to note here that government stakeholders played a very important role, because even if we have the research, if we have the data, if we have the information, and that information is not carried up to the level of policy making, then we are not moving, or we're not going places. Because the essence is to ensure that policies are developed in a way that that takes into consideration a number of issues, especially on biodiversity and biodiversity management. So the presence and the role of government stakeholders here was very vital, because they now have an understanding, a better understanding of the situation, and they are ready now to, in their different sector policies, to include, you know, to transcribe what the findings of our assessment actually are. And so this is a great opportunity, you know, bringing both policy and science and scientific knowledge together. For the approaches for engaging stakeholders, they are there by the right. Stakeholders were engaged using several approaches, including national workshops. You know, we organized several national workshops during which we brought stakeholders together and to be part of the assessment process, to make their contributions at each stage. Global workshops as well. The project was launched here, and we brought in a number of stakeholders that contributed and have been contributing to the process all along. Trilogues actually helps, you know, in building capacities, as I earlier said, you know, of stakeholders and authors. Consultation meetings, you know, these are some of the methods, the approaches we use to, you know, to engage our stakeholders, and virtual and online meetings. Next slide. Yes, challenges with government stakeholders and lessons learned. Yeah, I focused here principally on government, on challenges with government, since the Connect project, as I was told, is more concerned with government, you know, linking with government to see how. So I brought the challenges here. You see, I've listed 3 there. There is, first of all, the limited financial resources from government to support, you know, the process. Government, as we all know, especially in our context, the priority is given to a number of issues, but government, for now, most of these projects that are financed by donors, government, in most situations, comes to support. But if we, and at some point, the support is really limited and lacking completely. But however, during this process, the government actually did some, you know, played a good role, but financially there were some difficulties when we needed some support, but government could not. So these are one of the key challenges we faced. Secondly, there was a weak collaboration at the level of the government, because we had a change in the focal point in personality, and so the new focal point actually took time to understand the project, and that slowed down the process. So it was difficult, you know, and since it's a project that is the assessment is being carried out for government, for the state, and so it was necessary, and we cannot move without the concern of government or policymakers. And so that's another challenge we faced. Linked even to the third one, so because the delays by the Ministry of the Environment Ministry of Cameroon, to carry out review. And this is still linked to the second point, because the review process could not go on when the government, the ministry itself, at some point was one reviewing, because they had to, a second external review was proposed by the ministry. And so we had to give them time, and they took their time, and the time was so long, so it slowed down the process. You see some of the challenges we'll be having, but in a nutshell, the government stakeholder, or government as a stakeholder, was very important, played a very important role. You cannot, in as much as they did their best, we had the few challenges I listed there. And for lessons learned, it is important to say that stakeholder engagement is very vital for carrying out national ecosystem assessments, because you need everybody on board. You need the different groups, or the different stakeholder groups, to be concerned, to be involved in the process, so that everybody plays, they play their role as expected. Secondly, engaging key government stakeholders is an opportunity for bridging knowledge gaps and ensuring the contribution of science-based information to decision-making. So government is a very key stakeholder, and in fact, this is an opportunity that bridges the gap, and that narrows the gap actually, to make sure that the two, that is policy and research, they understand themselves, and they come to a common understanding and help to transcribe or to move this up to policy level. Thirdly, the government stakeholders provide vital technical support to the national or the provider. Yeah, this is very important, because they have a good, they have professionals, they have trained staff or trained experts in environmental and biodiversity issues. So we used, actually, the ministry staff was actually very useful to us in the process. So the ministry, during meetings, they had to send qualified staff, and so they played a very good role. And the last point, the last one is about dependence on donors. So it's difficult when the government depends largely on donors for things that concerns the state. However, I want to believe that the government is trying its best, but they need to do more. I think, in a nutshell, that is a summary of what I prepared for this meeting. Once more, sorry for the hitches. Preparing for another meeting now. Thank you very much. I'm waiting for the questions.
No problem, Stanley. Thank you so much. I was really intrigued by your point about this one key official changing or not being present anymore, and how that has a real impact for the process that you're trying to run. So I think it links quite nicely to Dillis's earlier point about how those shifts in landscapes can have real impacts as well for the system that you're operating in. Kira, I wanted to bring you in just for a quick reflection, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Stanley, for sharing that kind of case study. It's really good to see another real world example of a biodiversity mainstreaming project. And I thought it was really interesting how you spoke about, bringing such a diverse group of stakeholders in at the very beginning, helped you to kind of understand what the demand was for this assessment, and helped you to understand what needs and information gaps the assessment could address. So great to see this kind of example of stakeholder engagement really shaping this biodiversity mainstreaming process.
Thanks, Kira.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kay.
And just a question from my side then, Stanley, and then we'll go into the panel discussion with the other panelists. We'll bring them in as well. Question from my side, Stanley, was, this process in and of itself, and we talked about how do you go beyond just pure project-based activities, but your assessment, just to put it really plainly, is a continuous process. It comes with a report, but could you explain the timeline that goes into your national ecosystem assessment?
Yeah, the time that we had the assessment was programmed for, it was a 4-year process that started in May 2017, and it was supposed to end in January 2021. And we've had an extension, a no-cost extension. And the process we had, you know, it was, since it's research, it's an assessment, and we had it in stages. We had to, you know, to develop a scoping report, first of all. After the scoping report, we needed to, you know, we had to go into the first or the zero order draft, the first order draft and the second order draft, which we had finalized, but because of the review process that took time, probably because of the ministry's delays, for some reason, they best understand, but we've had challenges, a number of challenges, you know, at some point, financial challenges, and, you know, with the presence of COVID and all of that. So it's a process that brought in authors, national authors, you know, as part of the process. They're the ones who carried out the assessment. Principally, we had the academia from universities and research institutions and experts who worked around biodiversity issues in Cameroon. So we brought a good number of stakeholders, you know, into the process, and we are where we are today. Actually, next door, it's a meeting. Immediately after this, I'm rushing back because we're finalizing with authors now, based on the last review comments we received.
It's great to have a sort of your live behind the scenes insights about what's going on next door, Stanley. So it's brilliant. Thank you. I want to continue on that trend of stakeholder engagement. Wanted to bring you in, Andrew. I think, we talked about collecting data, thinking about who is going to use the data. But from your perspective, Andrew, what are some of the key practical considerations to take into account when you're curating that data? So how do you prepare and how do you process the data to make sure that you and other stakeholders, your target stakeholders, can actually use, and how do you optimize the use of that data, please?
So I guess ultimately it really depends on defining the use of that data. So how would you be using that data? That essentially will define what type of data you'll be needing, the quality of data that will be needed for that use. Also potentially any gaps that there might be in the data that you need, where you might need to fill in some of those gaps. And then essentially looking to see what already exists. There's a lot of data that already is out there. Once you've defined your user needs, then you can take that existing data, you can improve the quality, you can process it in a way, into a format that can be used to feed into into that use. And you can also look at your data gaps, and you can identify where there may be institutions that can be bringing in additional data to fill in some of those gaps. There are people out there that can help you with this process. So, for example, our nodes would be people that could help in terms of bringing in these new institutions, in terms of standardizing the data, in terms of publishing that data and making it freely available. And that's also another key point, is make sure that the data is accessible. There's a lot of data that's hidden in people's offices, and it's not freely available. And of course, you want to be using this data longer term. So making it freely available is important. And then, of course, make sure that you attribute the use of that data as well. There are people collecting that data. It's important that they know that their data is being used in some of these processes. Often this data will be used to create some sort of information product. We have no idea which data is being used in that, and the real value of the data is almost lost without correct attribution. So yeah, those would be some of the sort of practical tips.
Could you just really quickly give us just one example of such a use case then, Andrew, how the data on your platform has been provided to perhaps governments, or how is that? Can you give us an example of how has that been used in the past?
Yeah, so an example that we have would be one. So we had a project where the data was so essentially what they were developing were red lists at a national level of freshwater biodiversity. These were feeding into maps that would be feed into decision-making processes, so for identifying key biodiversity areas, for identifying areas that might want to feed into planning processes. Once we know that the data has to be fed into a red list, then obviously that data will have to be processed in a certain way. There'll be certain quality requirements of that data, but also it helped in terms of identifying where there were gaps. So in terms of, for instance, watersheds, where we had no data that was currently available, and then identifying institutions at a national level that could provide the additional data that could feed into these processes. So that would be a concrete example that we have from one project, but it's a similar concept across other projects as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Andrew. And indeed, as Kira put in the chat, please do ask your questions, your comments, or if you want to take the floor, please raise your hand, and then we can bring you in. I had a question for you, Alex, because I mean, Andrew also just touched on this collaborative approach. You're bringing this data to different kind of stakeholders, but then you're also able to identify those gaps. But from your perspective, Alex, what are some of the best practices of how you actually build collaboration between sectors and communities? And also, I mean, what I touched on earlier is how do you deal with tensions then and conflicting interests during that process? Any perspectives from your side, please?
I think that some of the main lessons we've had is to develop a deep understanding of not just the priorities of the institutions and sectors into which we're wanting to mainstream, but to understand their work plans, and to understand not just the kind of overall functions of that space, but to identify champions, like individuals within the right departments who can see the alignment between what we're wanting to do, and to really invest in those relationships so that you're not trying to build a partnership with an entire institution, but you're trying to build partnerships with a set of individuals who really understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish over years. And here that point of politics comes in again. So, you know, you're really looking for civil servants who are going the distance within that space in order to create systemic change, because what you're wanting to unlock is making sure that the mainstreaming priorities you've identified end up in people's work plans and ends up in the kind of core priorities for those production sectors. So I would say that through our experience of mainstreaming into the water sector, which we're currently very engaged with, and into finance sectors, it's like taking the time to find out, like, where do we have common goals? How do we build a common language? Because often across sectors, that takes time just to understand what words you use that mean different things. And then to identify those champions who are going to walk a long path with you. And in terms of tensions, it's a tricky one, because often the tensions are around perspective. And I think that, you know, goes back to that whole conversation around what we're trying to enable. So we've had these kind of situations with the mining sector and potentially with agriculture, and our use of systematic biodiversity planning and embedding those critical biodiversity area maps in kind of planning tools in spaces that are not from the biodiversity sector, so into municipal spatial development plans, into those kind of tools, really helps us to start looking at the same thing in a less charged way. So I think the existence of maps that various government departments are all looking at the same time has helped open up conversations that we couldn't necessarily have before.
Great, thanks, Alex. I wanted to bring this then to you, Stanley, because Alex just talks about, you need to build those champions. And Stanley, you touched on the impact of COVID already. Did the advent of COVID sort of compromise your ability to build those longer term relationships and really build up those champions? So what was the COVID impact when it comes to your national ecosystem assessment, Stanley, please?
Yes, Stefan. COVID actually had a negative impact, and it greatly affected the process, because with COVID, we had to limit the number of meetings and limit physical contact meetings. And so this was a major challenge, bringing together most, and if not all, of our stakeholders together and in one place to discuss and then to move on with the project. So this was a major challenge. Secondly, there are certain groups, because before it's difficult. There are certain groups, certain groups of stakeholders like the IPs and local communities. It is difficult. They don't have access to the internet. You can imagine at my level, we still have some connection problems. What more of people who are far off in the hinterlands? So that was a major challenge. However, with the COVID, we managed to keep the contact and to keep in touch with our stakeholders through virtual meetings. And such virtual meetings, you understand that some difficulties can never be the same as organizing physical contact meetings where you discuss. And so this was a major challenge, even though it didn't stop the process. So, but we continued to get in touch, to keep in touch by telephone, by internet, to discuss and see how we could move the process forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Stanley. Perfect. There's a question, and I think I'll direct this one to Andrew. Actually, there's a question from Alex. Alex, perhaps you just field it to Andrew. Go for it.
Yeah, just this kind of meta question of how do you mainstream mainstreaming effectively? Because we sometimes develop really great tools that have limited kind of penetration in the target audience because it's difficult to shift behavior, right? So in terms of that really lovely looking document that was presented earlier, what is the plan to mainstream it into the practitioners that you're targeting to shift practice?
Go for it, Andrew. And if other panelists want to come in, then please do. But Andrew, you want to have a go?
This might be aimed at Dillis's document.
Apologies. Then Dillis, please go, and then Andrew, you can complement. Sorry, go for it, Dillis.
Thanks, Alex. It's a really good question, and I'm actually going to hope that somebody from WCMC on the Connect project might chip in on this, because we need to get these tools widely disseminated and used, and that was part of the reason why we are developing this simplified guide to political economy analysis as a complement to that detailed one that I showed you the cover of. But there is an upscaling group associated with the Connect project who is tasked very specifically with getting the products more widely used, looking at how we might extend to other countries or how we might extend to other users. So I'm not part of that group, and I don't know exactly what the precise plans are, but it's definitely, that would be, we can't just develop tools and then sit on them, particularly when we're talking about mainstreaming. So the simple guide is one way to go, which we will make efforts to disseminate through our regular lists of, we have our own mailing lists, and the partners across the project have mailing lists, but there may be a specific strategy as part of the upscaling strategy for the bigger document. I don't know if a WCMC colleague can shed a bit more light on that.
Perhaps I think Nadine, I'll bring in Nadine in any case towards the end of this session as well. But Nadine, if you want to jump in right now, please.
I do. Thank you for that. As you say, it's the way of making these tools more effective and to ensure that they're being used on a sustainable basis. And actually, through some of our conversations that we've had very recently in Ghana, so one of the tools or outputs of the Connect project was a spatial biodiversity assessment in Ghana, and we had a really fantastic meeting with the Land Use and Spatial Planning Authority in Ghana on Friday last week, and they showed us how they've already been using the maps produced through this spatial biodiversity assessment for their infrastructure planning, for their oil and gas infrastructure, and how some areas have been avoided because of the things that are shown on the maps. And then to come back to this question, following on from that, is that they actually specified that if we could roll this training and guidance out at a more local district level, that's where the real to use a kind of cheesy term, the rubber hits the road, right? So the local level planners are the ones that really have the power to use this information and really have impact at that local level. And so they were saying if we could go just that one step further, the national level, it's already been implemented through these maps and this infrastructure planning. As I said, but if it could be, they feel that if it could be rolled out at the district level, that's where the real impact can happen. And it's through the conversations with that specific sector, in that case, a specific agency, that we find that it's through understanding how their decisions are made and who makes that decision at which point and what format do they need it. And because the Land Use and Spatial Planning Authority have been a real key partner for us throughout the project, that they've been able to have input into the design of the maps, so that when the maps are produced, they can immediately use them. And even before we hadn't even realised that things had been used already, but we were very, very happy to find out about that. Great,
thanks for jumping in, Nadine. Conscious of time, I think we have 5 minutes left. I just want to sort of initiate the wrap, and I really want to just get a perspective from each panelist on what your main conclusion from today, but also where do you think is the most promising area or for projects or topics that you will be working on. And perhaps Andrew, I can give you the floor first. I mean, you talked about the environmental DNA already, so maybe you can touch on that in your conclusion, and then I'll bring in the other speakers to wrap up as well. Please, Andrew.
Yeah, so I guess the most promising area right now is we have these new data use projects that we've launched, and this is really about creating some of these relationships that we've been talking about through this webinar. So we have our community is very technical focused. They work with data on a daily basis. They don't necessarily have the relationships with the decision makers that they show. So we really want these projects to work on that and build those relationships at the national level so that the data is flowing in. In terms of promising area for projects, so the eDNA, that is something that is going on all the time. So we've developed guidelines, and any of our data publishers can be publishing that kind of data through Gbif. So we've now made that possible for them. So that will be essentially up to the data publishers themselves to provide that data. Other areas that we're working into in the future is more thematic areas of data mobilization. So things like soil biodiversity, human health is another area where we're sort of targeted data mobilization, and private sector as well as another area where we're doing focused data mobilization in the future. So those would be the sorts of areas that I would say are kind of upcoming. So building these relationships with the decision makers, and then focusing in on targeted thematic data mobilization to bring in more data to fill gaps.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. And perhaps I can pass on to you then, Alex, to wrap up. I mean, you talked about river basin being one, and water being one priority, but tell us what you'll be working on as a priority for the the future to come, please.
Thanks. Yeah, along with our work into the water sector, our work into the finance sector is feeling incredibly important right now. And I think that, you know, there's a bit of a tipping point in terms of the way that financial institutions globally are looking at biodiversity. So there's a lot of opening opportunities for the way that we work with development finance and national treasury around biodiversity. And the other two areas I would say are, you know, the next year is going to be about the finalization of the new global biodiversity framework for the Convention of Biological Diversity, and the position of mainstreaming within that framework, and the amount of attention that is paid to the means of implementation necessary to ensure that effective mainstreaming is possible in terms of capacity development, technology transfer, resource mobilization, is something that we're keeping a very firm eye on and offering advice into in the African space. And then lastly, work that I'm really enjoying doing right now is looking at the science of science-based policy advice and mainstreaming, and really consolidating our approach and our knowledge base around, and I've heard terminology like nudging and various other kind of behavioral economics informed things today, and yeah, engaging with that world as practitioners who are consolidating our experiences and drawing on all of the behavioral science happening in the space is another thing that we're looking at. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. I'd love to have a bilateral conversation with you as well on this one. So perfect. Dilys, could you just wrap up your conclusion and what you're working on in the future, please?
Yeah, thanks. I'd reiterate Alex's point about the CBD COP15 coming up, if it ever does happen. So we're obviously still concerned about mainstreaming biodiversity, not just in development, but also in climate change strategies and approaches. And actually we see real opportunities in bringing together the biodiversity and climate change and development agendas, and making the case that these are sort of a triple emergency, as we're calling it here in the UK, that need to be addressed. And I think this is where political economy and data really come together, because there's a load of political interest in nature-based solutions at the moment as solutions to climate change, biodiversity loss, and human development issues. There's lots of political space to be working in this field, you know, notwithstanding the restrictions of having to do things virtually, so not having the level of engagement one might have normally had. But what we're really struggling with is getting really good, solid evidence and data on the effectiveness of these approaches. So I really see that as a key area where we need to bring together our kind of political working relationships and really excellent data and evidence to really push this joint agenda.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dilys. And then last but not least, Stanley, your final thoughts. Go for it.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Well, after we are rounding off with the assessment, the results or the report is going to be, you know, validated anytime soon. And we're going to look up to the next stage, which is the communication. We're going to be communicating the findings of this the research, of this assessment, and to see, you know, with different stakeholders to ensure that, you know, they consider this in their various roadmaps, on their various programs and their various policies. So in fact, your Connect workshop has been an opportunity for me to share and to learn, and continue from there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stanley. I think for us in the Connect project, I think we're in the same boat, trying to figure out, okay, how do we communicate and make sure the uptake of the Connect project findings. So perhaps, you know, we're definitely worth a bilateral discussion there as well. So thank you so much, Stanley. Then I'll just give the floor to Kira just to wrap up and say thanks. Conscious of time, we're 1 minute over time, but quick thank you from my side already. But Kira, please take the floor.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming along today. It's been brilliant to have these diverse perspectives coming in around biodiversity mainstreaming, and lots of good kind of food for thought about how we can improve the longevity of biodiversity mainstreaming. So thanks to all the speakers and thanks to all the participants for coming, and do look out for the other sessions taking place next week.
Indeed. So Monday and Tuesday, we have 2 more sessions. So please, if you haven't already, please do register for those, and we're looking forward to seeing you there. That being said, have a nice afternoon, and big thank you also to our interpreters. Some of them got up very, very early. So Mayra, big thanks to you and your team. And a big thank you to all our participants for joining in and listening in. And this recording will be available, so we will be sending this through. And again, looking forward to seeing you next week for our 2 other sessions. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.